So I'm going to move right in to the basics here in terms of our modeling. Excuse me, I have an injured vocal cord, so my voice goes in and out. So here we're going to be thinking about this endogeneity of exposure. So people can be exposed to other people who offer them information and opportunities, and that exposure is something that they have discretion over. And in particular, we'll be thinking about neighborhood choice in what I'm going to be talking about today. So people are going to be choosing where they're going to live, with the understanding that that has opportunities for their children in terms of what their children's future income will look like depending on where they move. And what is going to be new about this is we're going to be thinking about this in the context of networks where people will, if they're moving, there's a cost of moving to a new area in terms of what network you're forming and what network you're giving up. So parents are going to be making these choices based on networks, and that networks will impact the children eventually in terms of their outcomes. And this is going to be different from sort of standard human wealth and human capital kinds of models that have looked at poverty traps. And those kinds of models will have very different predictions here. And in particular, one of the things I'll just sort of highlight, one of the main things here is in a lot of those models, if you just give families money, so eventually if you had a program where you just did redistribution, so tax the rich and give the money to the poor, you can actually correct the problems, because then the poor can invest in their education, they can invest in their children and so forth. And in this kind of model, there'll still be reticence of people to move. So if you just give them the income, the parents won't necessarily change the neighborhood. And so we'll try and understand what kinds of policies you would need in this kind of setting to overcome this. Okay. Outline, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with background observations to motivate the model. So I'm just going to give you a bunch of facts, stylized facts from data, and then just give you a quick overview of our model and the basic results. And then I'm going to come back to sort of a policy discussion and talk a little bit about the potential for social engineering. How can we change people's networks, and do we want to? Okay, so I'm going to start with just background. This is a couple of papers I wrote with Raj, Teresa Kukler, Johannes Strobel, and then a large group of people. Mike Bailey at Facebook was very instrumental in this. But this came out of trying to understand people's social networks and how they impact outcomes. And I'll tell you a little bit about the data and then just some of the main findings we had there. So the data, US Facebook users, the last pull of the data was just before it was published, was in May 28th of 2022. We focused on the age cohort of 25 to 44-year-olds, and we did that because people younger than 25 have moved off Facebook. They're mostly in Instagram and TikTok and other things. We actually use Instagram data to check for younger. That's in the appendix. 30-day active, at least 100 friends. It's going to be US data that we're looking at. And then this ends up with, the nice part about this age cohort is twofold. One, it gives us about 84% coverage of all the age group. And the other is that then we can actually match people with outcomes. So we can see, what's happening in terms of high school friends, college friends, work friends. So we can trace people over time. And I'll say a little bit about that towards the end.
When you say active, you mean posting or just watching?
Active, so that they don't have to necessarily post. So 30 days active means that they've logged onto their account and spent some time on there. So so they're actually using the platform in this time period, but they're not necessarily posting or reacting to things. Okay. So I'm going to break. So the basic idea here, we want to understand which aspects of social capital are going to affect economic outcomes. And so what we're going to do is break social capital into different pieces. So when you hear the word social capital, it's often very nebulous. And if you read a lot of the literature on this, social capital means all kinds of different things to different people. And it's usually not defined in terms of specific measures, but it's often defined, trust or your connections or your network, something fairly vague. And so here we're going to break it into a series of different definitions, and then we'll see which ones of these definitions actually correlate with outcomes. So the first one we're going to look at is what Robert Putnam, in terms of his book, refers to as bridging capital. right? So this is the idea of you're bridging across groups, you're reaching out to people who have information that you don't have or have opportunities that you don't have, some kind of bridging going across, okay? And in particular, what we're going to look at is what's sort of an inverse homophily. So we're going to look at cross-class connections as one way of doing this. So in particular, think of poor people. So we're going to look at income. So we can look at these 84% of the US population in this age group. We can estimate incomes for each individual. And I'm happy to talk later about how we estimate incomes. So the idea here is we're going to be looking at poor people, and we want to ask how well are they connected to wealthier people. And so we have income estimates for each individual user of Facebook. And then what we'll do is just do a median cut of the population. And then we're gonna rank people into poor or rich. And then we'll just ask what fraction of your friends, if you're poor, are rich, okay? And there'll actually be a lot of variation across the US in this measure. So poor people in some places are well connected to rich people, some poor people in other places are not. And so that'll be one basic measure we're going to use of this sort of cross connection. And you can use a lot of different measures. You could do cross-language connections, cross-age connections. So you could be looking at, how well are the young connected to the old? How well are the people who are non-English speakers connected to English speakers? So there's a number of different kind of integration measures that you could be thinking of. And what we're going to focus in on is three of them in the data. We'll look at economic connectedness, the income one. We'll look at language, and we'll look at age. But you can do a bunch of others as well. We weren't when you're working with private data, you do have some limitations on what kinds of things you can infer. So we did not do ethnicity, but you could also do ethnic integration as well. Okay, so that's the connectedness, and basically what we're going to be doing is for this, you've got some number of friends above median, and divide it by half just to normalize it. So 1 would mean that you're at sort of a normal, typical person. Above 1 means that more than half your friends are rich, and below 1 would be fewer. Okay. If you just look overall across the U.S., below median SES people, 32% of their friends are above, and above median SES individuals, 72% of their friends are above. So there is homophily along income, and that's going to happen for many different reasons. And when we come back to the policy discussion later, we'll talk about why it is that these friendship networks are so segregated by income. Okay, so that's one form of social capital. The other one that is often, yeah. So how do we, okay, so the way we did it is we have location for individuals on Facebook. And then we have census block data. So we have fairly tight data on incomes. And then what we do is we build a model using attributes so we use 22 different variables we can observe about the individuals on Facebook. Cell phone, so your cell phone operating service is actually one of the main predictors. There's a bunch of different predictors when you log on, all kinds of things that we can track about the users. And we use that to calibrate a model of income from the IRS data at the block level, and then we infer things. I'm happy to talk offline about how more details of that, but we actually, it calibrates fairly well. So then we do, hold out samples and test how well we're matching incomes. So we can match incomes pretty well with this. Okay, and one other comment on that, we did not use Facebook's inference of income because they use the network itself to infer the income, and we didn't want to use, how well connected you are and so forth to do that. Okay, cohesiveness is what's referred to as bonding capital often. And so here there's there's various measures of this, but let me give you a couple of them. So one of them would be what's known as clustering in this networks literature. So person A has 2 friends B and C, and then what's the chance that B and C are communicating with each other? And the idea of this is, goes back to James Coleman, the sociologist in the 1980s, was talking about if I have 2 friends and they're communicating with each other, then they can help enforce norms. So if I misbehave, those 2 can gang up on me and ostracize me. So that's a way of enforcing norms. There's also, whether A and B have a friend in common, that can strengthen the relationship. So if you're trying to hire somebody and you know the person's advisor, that gives you more reason to hire the person than not. So there's, these kinds of things, that kind of information and so forth helps build those relationships and help support those relationships. So these are different reasons that you could expect that, when you have triangles in networks, that's going to help the functionality of the network. So you have a better working network if it's got these triangles in it. So there's two different types of theories and various papers about this. I won't go into the list of them, but you can imagine that would be another thing that might indicate that my network is a strong one. The third, which is what Putnam talks about a lot in his work, is things like trust, culture, norms, functioning of institutions. And so there, you look, so the kinds of things we're looking at is volunteering rates. So if we look at a certain zip code or a certain county, we'll ask, what's the fraction of people that are volunteering? So here we can look at the fraction of population who are members of different Facebook groups. Are they working on these? There's a Penn State index, which counts civic organizations in an area. We can just count them directly off of Facebook, so we can look at the different groups that are associated with certain counties or certain locations. And so we can say how many churches or other kinds of groups are there in a certain location. So that's another measure. So we've got these three different sets of types of social capital, different measures within each one. And then what we're going to look at is we can look at this as a correlation between upward mobility and measures of social capital. Yes?
I was wondering whether the Facebook data allows to somehow learn about how people met their friends and whether this varies for high or low income.
Dramatically, and I'm going to actually show you that. So when we get to the policy, I'm going to start telling you where these friendships are made, and then what we learn about how differently they're made in different locations, and how that affects the value of the friendships. And yes, that's an excellent question. We'll get to that in the data. Okay, so this is just so here we're just looking at raw correlations. And what we're looking at is upward mobility. So in particular, this is a measure that comes out of a paper by Raj and other co-authors. So you look at a kid who grew up in the bottom half of the income distribution, middle of the bottom half, the 25th percentile, and then you ask, what's their income as an adult? And then that has in different places in the US. So let me actually show you. This is the map of that, right? So this is from the Chetty, Friedman, Hendren, Jones, Porter paper. So this is, they grew up when their parents earned $27,000, 25th percentile of the income distribution. When they grow up, what is their income? Okay, so that's a measure of economic mobility. And the interesting thing about this map is that it's dramatically, the range here is from less than 20,000 to more than 55,000. And when you look across the US, you see geographic patterns, right? So part of this came out of when Raj came to Stanford in 2015, 2016, we started talking about, is there something that explains the geography of this map? Can we see different network signatures in different places that help explain, are people better integrated in some places than others? That was the kind of thing that we wanted to look at, and part of the reason we started looking at Facebook data was to try and explain what's going on in this map.
In the southeast, there would be negative intergenerational.
Yeah. So you could grow up poorer than your parents if you are in some of these areas. And in these areas, so it's not a rural-urban thing. If you look in Nebraska, Iowa, and so forth, these people are growing up to be wealthier than their parents, much wealthier than their parents. And here you're growing up to be poorer than your parents, right? So there's a dramatic variation across the country. Okay, so first is we get a correlation. Economic connectedness is a strong correlate. The others do not correlate nearly as well, and some of them, in fact, are negatively correlated. In respect to this morning's talk, spectral homophily, so we also do a spectral measure of the network. I'm happy to talk later about why it is that the spectral measure actually doesn't seem to correlate nearly as well as the economic measure. So there are all measures of splits. This is a very particular one, and it's a better measure for this particular reason, for this particular measure of outcome.
So, and the wealth of the state?
The wealth of the state.
Yeah, because it seems that stay put if you are from a rich.
Yeah. So you can correct for a lot of these things, and a lot of these relationships will the appendix of this is 100 and some pages, and so it's not just the region itself. So we can control for a lot of the fixed effects of the regions, and I'll show you some regressions later that will do that. This is just a multivariate regression where you put all of these things in there, and effectively you still get the same kind of structure. Okay, so now you can begin to look at upward mobility, and you can look, for instance, at median income of the area. And interestingly here, when you have median income, so this is usually a strong predictor of upward income mobility. And what happens is once you put economic connectedness in, then this drops to not, it's completely mediated by the presence of economic connectedness. You can do, this is counties, zip codes. You can look at the poverty rate. Similar here, income segregation, racial segregation. One thing that's interesting is when you do sort of income inequality, the usual relationship is sort of Gatsby curve, that's where income inequality is related to low mobility. That's completely mediated effectively by economic connectedness as well. So a lot of these things, once you put economic connectedness in, then these other variables that often explain lack of mobility are predicted through the economic connectedness. Okay, so this was the map of upward mobility. Here's the map of economic connectedness. So again, now low economic connectedness, this means that less than half of as many friends as you should have on that one scale. And here, people are more connected than you would get at random. So you see a similar pattern. So the pattern of economic connectedness is very tightly connected to the map of upward mobility. Yes, Guy? Taxes and benefits, no, not in this map, not in the maps. And in the taxes and benefits, I think here don't explain this economic connectedness, and they don't tend to explain a lot of the upward mobility. So we do control in one of the appendices for pretty much, you can throw in, so one thing you can do is throw in county fixed effects, which track a lot of that, and then you still get these relationships holding within zip code. We did it down to the block level. We didn't release the block level data because of privacy concerns. But yeah, it's it's robust to county fixed effects, which pretty much track whatever other kinds of variables you would want.
So why is there such a map of economic connectedness?
So I'm gonna go into that. So that's part of the reason. Part of it is understanding what's going on. Why is there so much different connectedness here? And we have a bunch of different answers for that. So yeah, there's a lot of yes.
Do you have a non-Facebook generated measure of income variance within schools? Because these age groups, I remember you make
Yeah.
at the school gate, and I would have thought that
Yeah. Yeah, so actually one graph I don't have in this set of slides, but what we did is you can redo it. You also can use the Add Health data. So the Add Health data has parental, so it's got networks of kids within schools, 84 schools in the US, and it has their parent data. And then you can look at the economic connectedness, you can look at the different regions, and you can reproduce this. It's a lot noisier than this because we have, 72 million observations. That's a few thousand observations. So our graph looks like a line through the Add Health data. Yes.
Just to make sure that the median is common here.
Yes. Yeah.
Relative, so it could be exposure.
Yeah. Exactly. So we're going to unpack how much of it is exposure and how much of it is actually friending conditional on exposure. Exactly. So you can break that into two. And I'll get to that in just a second. So let's get to that now. In fact. Okay. So let's suppose that you should have 50% of your friends, if you were just evenly mixing, be rich. And what you could say is part of it is exposure. So maybe I'm in an area where only 40% of my neighbors are rich. So I don't have the opportunity. So that's one reason that I might have low economic connectedness, is just that they're not around. And the second reason is that you could have bias on top of that. So beyond the fact that there's not people around, conditional on having that opportunity to form a friendship, I don't form it.
I'm not sure I remember, but connectedness here is measured by the links that you have on Facebook.
Yes.
So you need not, I mean, you may have friends who live in different regions, maybe in different countries.
Yes. Yeah. So Facebook is an imperfect measure of your friendships. And there's a series of papers that sort of look at how well correlated Facebook friendships are with your overall friend, and yeah, so they're going to be missing friendships.
Because I mean, so Florida is also a country where people immigrate when they are old. So maybe they kept relationships with people from very different states.
Yeah. So we don't keep. What we do keep is we keep all of your Facebook friends within the United States. So we don't keep foreign friendships. So we don't have, if somebody's a Cuban immigrant into Florida, we don't have their Cuban friendships. Yeah. But we have, I mean, so there's a lot of reasons to worry about Facebook data, and I won't go into all of them, but I think, I think that the basic idea that this economic connectedness matters seems to be something that's pretty robust. And that's something we've been doing now in data. We're collected across 58 different small-scale societies around the world, and we see similar kinds of patterns in those societies. So it seems to be something that's robust to different measurement, but there is a lot of measurement error in terms of what are all my true relationships and what is Facebook capturing. Facebook's better than some other measures, but it's not a perfect one by any means. And it's going to be biased differently. If anything, it's probably, it probably mismeasures more for wealthier people than poor people. So there could be biases systematically by wealth, but it could be it's that you're capturing fewer of the friends of wealthier people and more of the friends of poor people. So if anything, it's biased, towards higher connectedness than you would expect. Yes.
Just a follow-up question on that. Have you looked at the proportion of your Facebook friends that actually live in the same county?
Yeah.
That proportion varies a lot across counties?
It varies a lot across counties. That's a separate paper by Johannes and Mike Bailey. That's called they have a distant measure, and your distance of your friends it varies dramatically by your income level, and also by your location.
And then for this paper, maybe a robustness check would be to redefine the connectedness when you restrict attention to friendships in your county.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of restrictions. So we restricted it to your top 100 friends, to your top 50 friends, to your top 10 friends, to friends locally, and yeah. So it doesn't. It's pretty hard to make when you've got that strong a correlation. It's pretty hard to make it go away. So it's pretty robust to any kind of measurement corrections that we could do, but it's hard to know exactly. But yeah. So I think there's a lot more work to be going on to make sure that these things keep reproducing. Okay, so now we're going to decompose things into exposure and bias, and that'll explain, how much of this was just that there weren't people around, and how much of it was that I wasn't friending them, conditional on them being there. And when you begin to look at this upward mobility, remember this is breaking it down into economic connectedness. Now we're going to log things, and we log things because now economic connectedness is actually equal to exposure times 1 minus friending bias, right? So the way we've decomposed it, the product of SES exposure and 1 minus friending bias is equal to economic connectedness. And so now we can just decompose this regression, and so we can say, well, if you're looking at log of upward income mobility on log of economic connectedness, you get a significant result. We can break it into these two different pieces, and roughly, depending on whether you're doing zip codes or counties, it's roughly, 50-50, or some non-trivial fraction is explained by each. So part of it is that I'm living in an area where there's not rich people around, but then there's also part of it is I'm living in an area where there's rich people around and I'm not making friends with them. Both of those things are explaining why somebody who grows up in that area doesn't end up growing rich. And we'll break those things down by different neighborhoods and different ways that people form friendships. Okay, and so now to questions of where people form friendships. So this is your SES rank. And this is the relative fraction, just sort of adjusted. One would be the typical person, the fraction of their friendships that would be from neighborhood. And so 1.6, 1.7 means I'm forming 70% more of my friendships locally than the typical person. And what you see is wealthier people are forming fewer of their friendships locally. Poorer people are forming more of their friendships locally. And you can do this, so the 6 different ways we did this, you can do this by neighborhood. You can look at colleges that people went to. You can do it by workplace, recreation group, and so forth. And you see sort of systematic patterns that are consistent with what we would expect, right? Poor people are forming more local friendships. Richer people forming more of their friendships in college, university. And then the middle class, more in workplace, recreational groups, and these other kinds of interactions. So we've got different patterns by different income levels. And this means then that it's more important for poor people what their neighborhood looks like and what kinds of friendships they form in the neighborhoods. And so that's going to affect their economic connectedness.
So I wonder if it would be interesting to weight these by the number of interactions you have on Facebook. Because you may think, oh, I have a lot of college friends that in fact I never really interact with.
Yeah.
Interact with my neighbors also if I'm here, so.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have not looked carefully back to understanding, what's the frequency of interaction across these different ones. So it can be that wealthier people are more in touch with their college friends, poorer people are more in touch with people at their workplace, et cetera. So you could weight these things in other ways. Yes. Okay. Another fact that's going to be important for us is. Now we're going to look at the percent friends in this other SES group. So for the poor, this is the economic connectedness measure. And for the rich, this is how many poor friends they have. So if I'm rich, how many poor friends do I have? And what this is the slope of the interaction with what the percentage friends is, and then what's my predicted income if I grew up poor in this neighborhood. Okay, so we're just asking, what does the upward mobility look like? And this was the result that if I have more rich friends, I'm going to end up doing better as a poor person. The reverse is true for the wealthier people. Okay, so they've got a negative slope. So in areas where, if I'm rich, if I'm connecting more with the poor, in areas where that's happening, my kids are going to do worse than they would if I was in an area where we didn't connect with the poor. Now, one thing that I'm going to emphasize is the slope here is roughly, almost 3 times higher than the slope there, right? So we've got a stronger slope, and that's going to be important when I talk about the model. This is a stronger slope than that is, okay? Yes.
Your income, you're doing it nationally, right?
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering, like, in terms of upward mobility, if I'm a poor person, maybe it's better for me to be connected to someone who's not the richest of the
Yeah.
nation, but rich and closer, because I might get a job
Yeah.
compared to someone who's far, even if they're richer.
Yeah, so originally we did this by quintiles. So instead of above median and below median, you can look at quintiles and you can ask what happens to the bottom quintile and where does it depend. So if you look at the bottom quintile, it's more important how connected they are to the third quintile than the fifth quintile. So you're exactly right. There's a pattern here that's not fully picked up by this dichotomous one. The reason we did the dichotomous one was that it's easy to explain and we could release the most data with that one. So the tighter we made the data, the fewer regions we could release the data for. So we went with the crude one. But you're right, the patterns are quite interesting when you start breaking them down, which is the most influential group. And as you're pointing out, being connected to somebody who's really wealthy, if I'm really poor, doesn't necessarily help me at all, especially if they're distant or I'm not interacting with them much.
And predicted household income rank is predicted by what? By economy connected?
No, so this is from this Chetty paper, Chetty et al. Paper. So this is an exogenous measure of you look at a given region and you look at a kid who grows up in this bottom half of the income distribution. What's their predicted income as an adult?
So you want to think of it as an independent measurement, so it's
Yeah, exactly. And so this is saying, if you look at the friendship network, how much is that explaining of my eventual income? And it, more friends, higher predicted income of kids. And then reverse for the rich kids. Okay. Okay, so key observations from this. Specific form, this economic connectedness is predictive. Exposure, roughly half. Most friends of the poor are neighborhood-based. And different slopes of mobility for rich and poor.
Just a bigger picture question. So, why did you choose to be colorblind at that stage? So, not to invoke any sort of racial variables, because obviously the map that you showed, I just looked it up. I could superimpose it with the share of minorities. So, yes.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that?
Yeah. So two things. One. So let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, when we look, so imagine we just look at this relationship between economic connectedness. So if I try and redraw this graph in places where there's no ethnic differences. So what we do is we restrict to counties that are at least 90% white. We get the same relationship. So it's not coming entirely from race. But what is true is that if you look at places with high racial diversity, there's lower economic connectedness. So places with higher racial diversity have systematically lower economic connectedness, and so there's certainly a tie-in there. The reasons that we didn't do ethnic connectedness and so forth have to do more with data restrictions. So the difficulties of inferring race, that was someplace we were not supposed to go with our data. So we had a contract that we signed, and that was one of the agreements that we would not.
So you should think of part of this, for example, friendship bias, as coming potentially from racial.
Yes, yeah. So it could be coming from racial considerations. It could be coming from a lot of things. One thing that's interesting is when we talk about bias, don't be thinking about this just necessarily as just friendship choices that people are making. So it could be, for instance, I'll maybe show you at the end, when you look inside a high school, for instance, in the US, if you look at high schools that have separate honors programs and non-honors programs, you get less economic connectedness than in high schools where they just have one program and don't have these split outs by AP courses and non-AP or honors courses and non-honors courses. So it can be that there's systematic structuring within an institution that leads to this kind of bias. And it could be racial segregation in housing or in jobs and in education. There could be a whole series of things that are that are caught up in this bias. So the exposure just sort of says, overall, when we look at the mix of people in an area, what does it look like? And then the bias is capturing everything else. And there's a lot in that everything else that's going on. Yes?
One question about like number of your friends. For example, if I put 60% out of like 100, so I've got 100 friends and 60 of them are rich, or I've got like 10 friends and 6 of them are rich.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between these two groups? Like in both cases, I've got like 60%.
Yeah, we looked for sort of non-linear effects and threshold effects. We haven't really seen them. So it was very hard to see any kind of threshold effect in people that have fewer friends versus more friends. So you might expect a nonlinearity in these kinds of effects, and they seemed very linear. And so it could be that they're there, and it's just when we're aggregating on the data, we're not able to see it. But we looked and we didn't see anything systematic in that way. Yeah.
Sorry, shut me down if you need time, but a specific question about, so I guess the measures of cohesiveness and the measure of the economic are negatively correlated by construction, right? So in the end, what matters, is it the lack of cohesiveness that matters, or
Yeah. So actually, when you look at some of these other measures of social capital, so one question is, why didn't they correlate? Why doesn't clustering matter? Why doesn't support matter? Why doesn't spectral homophily matter? These kinds of things. What you do find is if you actually unpack this and you look at places, so if I'm in a place that has high economic connectedness, then those measures are actually positively related. So that sort of close to zero actually comes from some places that have very strong positive and some other places that have strong negatives. And so if you cross if you interact that with the economic connectedness, then you get a positive, significant effect. So it's basically that if your network is well supported, that helps you if you're well connected, and it holds you back if you're really segregated. So these other network measures are mattering in interesting ways, but it's much more subtle, and it's an interaction effect. So I'm not going through all this just from data time, but yes, that's a fascinating question, and I think it's interesting that you see we have some charts in one of the appendices that sort of break it down by different regions, and you get very different slopes in different regions based on how well connected they are. It's a really interesting dynamic, and it sort of says, your network can hold you back or help you depending on how well integrated you are. Okay, so we have these facts. I'll just run you through the model. Given the time, I'll run through the model relatively quickly and sort of hit the high points of what we wanted to do with the model. And the idea here is trying to figure out, if we want to think about integrating people and so forth, why is it that, if I look at one of these maps, go back to the map, if I'm living down here, why don't I move to somewhere that's better? Why don't I move to one of these blue regions and have my kid grow up there? Okay, well, that's a big move, right? So I've got to move from somewhere in Georgia to somewhere in Nebraska. It's a long way, and I sort of completely fracture my network. Well, if you start zooming in on cities in here, the city maps actually look like this. So if you look inside of Seattle, for instance, you'll see a map that has colors that look like this and colors that look like that are like 2 miles away from each other, or 3 kilometers, right? So, within a small distance, you get this when you start looking inside cities. Or if you look inside in Paris, there's areas that are going to have more connectedness and better off than other areas. So why is it that people aren't moving in these small distances? So what is it that's the impediment to moving? And one thing that's sort of interesting is there have been programs that have tried to give people money. And so you give people money and you say, here's some money. Now you can afford to move, and people don't move still, right? So it's not just a financial constraint. You give them enough to cover the housing difference, and they still don't move a short distance to a neighborhood that would improve their kids' outcome. And you explain, this will improve your kids' outcome. Here's some money. Go ahead and move. And people say, no, I'd just rather have the money. So there's something there that's not quite picked up fully, and so that's what we want to explain with the model.
Maybe this is from earlier, but when you're constructing these measures, the parents who earned less than 27,000, they are native. Or could they also be migrants as well?
Yeah. So these are people, if I remember correctly from that paper. These are people who filed income. They have a social security number and are filing a U.S. Income, but they don't necessarily have to have been natively born in the United States. Yes.
And you could see if this was the case or not?
Yeah. I'm not sure what you can see in the tax data. And we can make inferences on things by languages and so forth, but you'd be making, so you could begin to try and break this down by immigrants and non-immigrants and so forth. There's a paper, one follow-up paper by Drew Johnson and others has looked at Syrian refugees into Germany and how connected their networks are in different parts of Germany. So you can begin to unpack that by immigrant status and so forth as well. Okay, so we've got these facts. I'm just going to zoom through this. So there's a child, individual child I, time t, parent of that person. They live in a neighborhood, which is going to be chosen by the parent out of some set of neighborhoods, and they're going to choose some education or effort that they're going to do. And the idea here is really simple. So first of all, there's going to be some social capital that they get in their neighborhood, and the social capital comes in two parts. One is what's the education or effort level of their parent, and then the other part is the neighborhood, average neighborhood level, right? So I'm getting something from my parent and something from the neighborhood, and we'll have some weights on these, and then it's going to be done in sort of a CES form, right? So the beta here allows you to scale this up and down. Is what? S. So this is S is the social capital. So we're thinking of this as the social capital of your neighborhood, of individual I and kid I and neighborhood N is coming from the education of their parents, raised to some power times some variable. Then we also have from the neighborhood level, and then we do a CES version of this. Okay, so basically what this is going to do is, if beta is 1, then this is some weighted average of your parent and the neighborhood education. If beta is large, then this begins to look like the max. If beta is small, this begins to look like the min. Okay? And generally, beta large is going to match the data better. And you remember that chart that had a larger positive slope for the poor kid and a smaller negative slope for the richer kid? That would be consistent with a beta that's putting more weight on the bigger of these two, right? So if I'm rich, then it doesn't, my neighborhood doesn't matter as much. If I'm poor, then my neighborhood matters more, because so that beta, this is going to be, having beta be different than 1 is going to help us match that data in terms of those different slopes.
You allow for negative betas?
No, not negative.
Beta 0, so that's a perfect complement.
Yeah, beta 0, it goes to basically a min function. Yeah, if you go to the limit here with beta 0, so it's 1 over beta, right? So it's, yeah. So the way it's done here is different than 1 over 1 minus, which would be the other way you do it in terms of the elasticities. Yeah. Okay, so then the kids' payoffs are going to look like their effort times a type, right? So I've got some type, I'm putting my effort, this is my payoffs. So I educate myself, this is how much my education matters. This is sort of what's the weight on my own education and human capital. 1 minus P is how much depends on my neighborhood. So my connections, so I'm getting something from my own effort and something from my neighborhood. And then we add in here a conformity part where the kid has incentives to act like other people in their neighborhood. So they're going to try and match their effort to the typical social capital level in that neighborhood. And then a cost of effort, okay? So so we've got these different ingredients, right? Network benefits, the conformity pressure or peer effects, and then a cost of effort, okay? So that leads to a nice, simple, this quadratic form just gives us an effort level that you can characterize in terms of these variables. So how much does my effort vary with a neighborhood? And then I'll sort of skip through these. So basically what happens then is a kid with a higher level of parent effort, if we look at what happens as we change the effort in the neighborhood, so you sort of increase the connectedness in the neighborhood, what's happening? Well, the higher kid already has a lot from their parent. You're getting a smaller slope here than for the kid with a lower parent. And so the kid with a lower parent wants more from their neighborhood than the kid with a higher parent, right? So this is sort of benefits, if we thought about it from a planner's perspective, putting the kid, we want to increase this more for the kid with the lower parents than with a higher parent effort level or education level. Okay. So then that means consider 2 neighborhoods with 2 different effort levels. We could think about what happens if we start mixing the kids from these neighborhoods. What happens is, if we're moving the kids from the higher neighborhood, they're going down and being mixed. The kids from the lower neighborhood are being moved up. And now we get something which actually is exactly that thought experiment we had from before from the actual data. And what you can see is here the slope is higher. The upward slope here is higher for the kids moving from the poorer neighborhood to being more connected. And it's a lower slope for the people with a higher starting point and moving downwards. Okay, so you get exactly that kind of pattern we saw in the data before.
Can you just clarify why it's decreasing at the end?
Yeah. So why is it decreasing at the end? Yeah. So it's decreasing in the end effectively because there's a cost to my effort, and I'm also facing this conformity quadratic. So I want to be close. So if we go back to that utility function, let's see if I make sure I go in the right way. if I go back to this thing, right? This thing means that I'm being forced to take high efforts. And if you push this S to be really, really high, eventually I'm forced to conform to it, and it's costing me a lot. And so I really don't like to be pushed past a certain point. So in this kind of model, there's eventually decreasing returns to the social capital. Okay. Okay, so in this kind of situation, sorry, so if you mix neighborhoods, that would make all the kids better. A utilitarian, it would make, it's not a Pareto improvement, but it's an overall utility improvement by mixing neighborhoods. Okay, so now we have an endogenous, we have the parents choose neighborhoods. We take the kids type and cost to be independent of the parents, and then we examine the parental choice. And the model here is very simple. So we have, first of all, an altruism. So I care something about my kids' utility. I face my own conformity cost. So I'm moving to some area, and if I feel out of place, I get negative utility for that. And then there's some cost of neighborhoods. And then we just define an equilibrium to be parents' choices of neighborhoods, costs for neighborhoods, and then no parent wants to move. So given the costs and given the utility I would have from the different neighborhoods, including the altruism for my kid, and then whatever I would face, I'm happy in the neighborhood I'm choosing compared to some other neighborhood. Okay, so just a really simple idea of neighborhood choice. And then you can just work through what's going to happen in this model. Given the time, I'm just going to cut to the chase. So basically the key...
Mobility cost, because here it's a decision to move.
It's a decision to move, yeah.
There's no mobility cost.
So you can throw in the paper, we actually also have a cost of moving, an explicit cost of relocating. And that, it'll exacerbate these effects, but you don't need it to get these effects. So effectively, the cost of a neighborhood is just the price of the neighborhood. And that price of the neighborhood comes from the price of housing and so forth. And so we just treat that as a P variable, which is endogenous. So it's sort of like a competitive equilibrium. There's going to be a cost determined in equilibrium for each neighborhood. People who are willing to pay that move into that neighborhood. And the idea here is, the poor parents would like to move to a richer neighborhood for their kids, but they also don't want to move there because of the social cost to themselves. And then that allows for a difference here. And so what you get is effectively here, think of this as how much the parent cares about the local conformity pressure. So this is their measure of discontent, how much they measure the local cost. This is how altruistic they are. And what's true is when you look at mixing neighborhoods, mixing is utilitarian up to some point where parents are really have a huge cost of moving. So you don't want to relocate families if it's just going to make the family completely miserable. So if the parents really don't want to move, then it becomes utilitarian to keep them separate. But otherwise, it's beneficial to be mixing for the kids. And what happens is, in terms of the equilibrium structure, you end up with a large region where effectively, in terms of parameters, the stratification is the only separate neighborhoods for the rich and the poor is the only equilibrium, because the parents are not internalizing the externalities that they have. Richer parents are having externalities on poorer kids. That's not being internalized in the model. So the frictions here are, there's externalities between education of richer people and the outcomes of the poorer kids. And so you end up with a region where, mixed could be an equilibrium if it's really cheap for the parents and they don't really care that much about conforming and so forth. But once you get a little bit above that, then stratification is sort of the only equilibrium. Okay, so I went through the model just quickly just to give you an idea of it. But the idea here is this network cost of moving and this homophily factor changes the way that this works. And so now if I give people money, the equilibrium stays the same. So actually if you just pay increase the income of the parents, that won't change things because they still are going to feel this homophily pressure. They're going to feel different when they're moving into these areas. And so you still end up with the same equilibrium structure, even if you just pay the parents money in this model. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about improving social capital policies and so forth. So one policy implication of this kind of model is that small frictions can have large welfare impacts. So effectively, once you begin to subsidize some moves, then you start creating more economic connectedness, you create more integrated neighborhoods, and then it becomes less costly for more people to move. So there's sort of a multiplier effect, and like a small moving friction, once you overcome that, can actually have a big impact on the new resulting equilibrium. So if you put in small subsidies, you can actually rewire the neighborhoods endogenously quite a bit. Giving money directly has no impact, and that contrasts with most of the existing models, and the dynamics have this kind of multiplier effect. Okay, so now I want to go back to this sort of the Facebook data and think a little bit about this. So remember we had that the poor were making most of their friendships in the neighborhood and the rich were making most in college. This is the exposure by different areas. So 0.5 would be, average, half rich. So neighborhood for the poor people has the lowest fraction. If they do go to college, then they have the highest chance of being exposed. But most of the areas that they're in, they're getting less exposure, and the worst place for them to be making friendships is in terms of their neighborhood, which is where they're making the largest portion of their friendships. So the exposure is varying by different circumstances. And then you can also look at the bias. And the bias is also highest in neighborhoods. So even you're getting the lowest exposure and the highest bias in those neighborhoods. And actually, most of these other places have lower. The one that was sort of surprising, religious groups had a negative coefficient. So it seemed conditional. So they're not wonderful in terms of exposure, but conditional on exposure, then people are basically forming friendships pretty much across class lines within religious institutions. But you get an interesting pattern here. And so it does seem that there's different types of friendships that people are forming in different ways, and that has consequences for their outcomes. And we don't have specific policy prescriptions that come out of this, but it does give you a bit of the background pattern from this. So further thoughts on some of this? Understanding friending bias is also important. So we want to understand where that friending bias comes. And as I told you, you can begin to look inside institutions, and large schools tend to have more friending bias than small schools, which makes sense. If you're putting people in a place with thousands of other students, they tend to segregate more. If you look inside places where there's costs of joining different groups and so forth, you tend to see more segregation. So there's a bunch of different footprints that you can begin to see for why there's friending bias. One other comment here, we've taken a perspective which is very economic in terms of kids' future income. Homophily serves a lot of purposes, so you don't want to just go in and say, okay, we want to completely rewire people's networks. It could be that there's other things that they're getting from their networks that are beneficial, and rewiring them could lose some of that. And we have some other papers, we've looked at some of these costs, and this can be substantial. So there can be other benefits from having people who have similar outcomes. They're better able to relate to you, support you emotionally, physically. In terms of, we have stuff where we're looking at Stanford students and looking at people's mental health outcomes. You can see that there's a lot of benefits from this kind of homophily in certain circumstances. So you don't necessarily want to completely uproot things. Networks evolve based on the network, so changing things can have forward multipliers. That's this other important. And extreme neighborhood mixtures can stratify things as well. Okay, so summary, and then we'll have a few more minutes for discussion. Economic connectedness, strongly predictive. Again, not causal. So one comment on causality. There's a number of papers now that are looking at random fluctuations in, say, I look at a given high school, and I look year to year, and there'll be random fluctuations in the number of rich kids that are present in a school. So Faramala has a job market paper, I think, this year on this. where you look at those fractions of exposure year to year, and that ends up predicting economic connectedness and predicting the eventual outcomes, college attendance and other kinds of things. So you can get causal indications that this isn't just a correlation, but actually has some causal arrow to it. Unpacking how much of it is causal and so forth, I think will take a long time, but at least partly there's reason to believe it is. And we're doing more work with the Facebook data to try and unpack some of that. So I think there's reason to believe that there's some causality there. And then, these other cautions, I think social engineering is challenging and can have unintended consequences. So part of it is, there's sort of two ways of dealing with lack of economic connectedness. One is to try and increase economic connectedness, and the other is to try and figure out what is it that economic connectedness is doing for people, and then figure out what they're lacking from their network and try and provide that externally. So if it's, is it job opportunities? Is it education? Is it aspirations? What is it? Is it all of those that are affecting the kids? And then how do you get that to the ones who don't have the economic connections? Great. So time for a few more questions. Yeah.
The main cost of moving is the cost of conformity. If there was a cost of finding a job in a new place, and this would be connected to how far you are from the place, would it come boil down a bit to the same, or have you thought about that?
Yes. Yeah. So I think one reason that you have these difficulties in getting people to move as well is that so for instance, moving to the Silicon Valley for somebody who's poor, most of the jobs in the Silicon Valley are for highly educated individuals. So it could be more difficult to find certain kinds of employment if you move to that region, to an area that's concentrated. So the fact that jobs tend to segregate geographically by income level naturally means that there could be reasons that make it difficult for people to move. And that's another friction in addition to this. So here, part of what's caught up in that, cost function is a bunch of things, which are how well I match up to this neighborhood, and jobs could be one aspect of that. Yes, definitely. And I think that's something around the world that you see, right? It's, yeah.
Probably very naive, but one policy wouldn't it be just to inform people about this kind of research, like do big information campaign to let people know, as we do for health, recommendation, having a very homophilic, neighborhood network, because in the end, people just don't know, I guess.
Yeah. Actually, so to follow up on that, usually as an economic theorist, when you publish a paper, nothing happens. Some people read it, some people don't. Something. So these papers generated a lot of interest. I spent 2 days in Fresno. Fresno, California, has 9 of the 10 poorest zip codes in California. I spent 2 days there with various groups from the government and non-government. They're just really interested in this. And part of it is that they've been thinking so much about bonding capital and trying to build tightly knit groups and support groups, and they hadn't thought so much about this kind of economic connectedness as a possible variable. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that you're teaching the individual people, but you're just trying to educate policymakers, at least on the facts that we see. Again, we don't know causation, we don't know all the kinds of things that are going on, but making people more aware of how much this matters and so forth, it can matter at the policy level, and you can also help, educate. So Raj has been doing some work in Seattle and in trying to get families to move, and part of it was helping them out in terms of, giving them extra things to help them move, giving them information. There's just a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome, and overcoming all those hurdles involves some education, and I think it's very valuable at that level.
Some heterogeneity. Some people are connected because they have some characteristics that make them different from others.
So that, part of what we're unpacking with this causal stuff now is we vary year to year the amount of rich kids in a given cohort. So we're just looking at random variation in a high school cohort. We can look at what the friendships look like as a function of that. We can use that as an instrument for then the economic connectedness of those kids, and then follow forth what they do in college, whether they go to college and what income is. And so you get causal evidence there. So it seems that there's really a channel here, and it's not just unobserved heterogeneity.
The causality from connectedness to the outcome variables, but who's connected?
Yeah. Yeah. There's going to be some people.
That makes them look
No.
for
Sure.
good friends and others.
Yeah. There's definitely individual heterogeneity in friendships, and there'll be some people that you could put in the right circumstances and so forth. They wouldn't form the friendships, and they're never going to move. But it does seem that there's some other people that it might make a difference for. So yeah, it certainly could be.
People to connectedness.
Yeah. No, I think part of it is being aware, and then whether or not people act on that is a different question. Yeah.
I was wondering what's the size of the neighborhood? Because I can imagine it's the granularity of it
Yeah.
is hugely important because the block is going to matter more. And
Yeah.
some of the neighborhoods as being served by the same school, for example, would be a way to kind of discipline the exposure.
Yeah. So the neighborhoods here, I believe we did block. We did census block, and then we did zip code. We didn't quite do school districting because that got a little messy with the data, but you can do it at different levels. And here we defined it by, I think it's most of the data I showed you from those graphs were zip code based data. But you can do it at different levels, and it certainly matters, urban and rural. So if I start thinking about a zip code in Manhattan, that's a much different animal than in like a rural area. So it's hard to keep making those adjustments. Yeah.
You've already said this, I guess, but it does seem that whether rich and poor people know each other is incredibly endogenous to a whole bunch of things that you think would have an effect on income mobility themselves. And I really just
Yeah.
repeat the point because Raj is supposed to be going out and trying to get people to move, but I would have thought it would be easier, maybe politically easier also, to try to address the underlying drivers of why people are not, and things like school financing.
Yeah.
These weird things that you have in America, the way that works.
Yeah, actually, so quick comment, and then we should probably just take a break and we can talk more at break. But the one program that seems to work well for the schools is, so take a school, Evanston High School, where Northwestern is. Evanston High School is one of the most integrated high schools on paper. It's actually got very low economic connectedness. And it's a very big school, right? It's got several thousand students in it. And so one thing they can begin to do is say, well, with a huge school like this, we end up with like the richer kids all in the honors courses never meeting up with the poor. They just don't see each other at lunch. So really simple things where they begin to say, well, actually, let's have a class where kids meet just randomly. We're going to randomly put kids in a class. They're going to spend an hour a day together working on some projects. We're just going to force them to, do some history project or do some geography project. They're going to do that. And that could help them form those friendships. So there's simple things like that can be done that don't involve re-engineering, moving families, relatively cheap, and a large school can begin to look like a smaller school. So these are kinds of programs we've been talking about with different schools, how to do this, and that's the kind of thing that could begin to make a difference, yeah.
I also think people have attachments to actually locations, not just homophilic attachments to or repulsions, but they actually like this place, and also you've invested a lot of
Yeah. Yeah, those costs are huge. Yeah. So overcoming those could be almost impossible. And so in the end, doing some other things that are smaller cost could be much better, yes.